For generations, families in the depths of the United States lived on the sidelines of society, preserving a legacy of consanguinity that deformed and destroyed its own strains. Incest cases and their genetic consequences were never fully revealed, hidden in the shadows of the story, far from the eyes of the public. This documentary reveals the obscure secrets of families whose stories were silenced and distorted over time. In this documentary, we will explore the real cases of families whose lineages were devastated by generations of marriages between relatives, leading to physical deformities, diseases, and a stigma that echoes to this day. What these families faced and the impact that their choices had for the following generations reveal more than only the story of a forbidden act, show the consequences of guarded secrets and how they changed the fate of many. The camera focuses on old images with the vision of isolated villages and faces that carry the scars of the past, while we go to the region of the Appalachians where the history of the Kellogg family began, hidden from public view and ignored by many years. Check it out if it is already subscribed to this channel so as not to lose more rare and impactful stories that they are carefully hidden from the eyes of the public. In a remote region of the Appalachians where the outside world seemed distant and the possibilities of marriages outside the community were practically non-existent, the history of the Kellogg family began. It was a time when geographical and social limitations created a closed cycle where relatives' marriages were often the only options. What began as a seemingly innocent and common practice at the time would soon become a devastating legacy of consanguinity that will forever mark the following generations. In the early years of the 19th century, in an isolated area of West Virginia, members of the Kellogg family were known for their simple experience focused on the basic survival needs. The community, located in the mountains of Appalachians, was formed by few families who knew each other very well and depended on each other for support. There was no easy access to other villages or cities, and the idea of marriage outside the community was practically unthinkable. According to local records, the first marriage within the Kellogg family itself occurred around 1820 when Ezekiel Kellogg, a young family member, married his cousin Sarah Kellogg, who like him came from the same small community. Marriage was seen as a practical solution. The options for outside the community were minimal, and due to isolation, the idea of preserving the lineage in the family was considered normal. Over the years, this kind of union between cousins has repeated itself, perpetuating practice within the family itself. The first act of family incest was motivated by a combination of factors: the isolation, the scarcity of new people in the region, and a particular view of the preservation of the family lineage. It was not a case of forcing but a shared decision among family members who saw this as a way to strengthen family ties and ensure the continuity of family business and land. The choices were made for social and economic convenience without real knowledge about genetic effects. After the marriage of Ezekiel and Sarah, the first child of the union, James Kellogg, was born in 1821. James presented physical characteristics that immediately caused strangeness to the community. He had facial deformities, motor difficulties, and a delay in cognitive development, making him unable to communicate properly. The lack of understanding of genetics at that time caused these problems to be attributed to unknown factors, and the community did not associate these difficulties with a common marriage practice among close relatives. Gradually, the physical impact of marriages between cousins was becoming clear. Children and grandchildren of the first couples began to have similar health problems such as more pronounced facial deformities, difficulty in mobility, severe cognitive disabilities, and even heart disease. However, the practice of marriage between family members continued largely due to the lack of external options and the stigma that involved the deviation of the community standard. In the following years, marriages within the family were repeated. In 1850, John Kellogg, Ezekiel's nephew and son of James, married his first cousin, Mary Kellogg. This marriage, like the previous ones, was considered by the community as acceptable and even necessary. The couple had several children, many of whom were born with the same health problems observed in previous generations, including microfil, movement difficulties, and facial anomalies. The physical consequences of such unions began to become increasingly evident, but practice continued to be considered a necessity in the small community. The emotional impact was also deep. Many family members have begun to live on the fringes of society, unable to connect with others and often victims of isolation. The shame and stigma around malformations and cognitive deficiency were palpable. However, these feelings of guilt and shame were often drowned out of the insistence of keeping the family united and strong according to community traditions. Over the decades, the wedding cycle between cousins and close relatives in the Kellogg family has remained. In 1880, a new generation of descendants came together within the same lineage, and once again, the consequences were devastating. William Kellogg, son of John and Mary, married his aunt, Eliza Kellogg, leading to the creation of a new generation of individuals with severe physical and mental disabilities. These weddings were no longer questioned within the family. For the Kellogg, it was a common and even expected practice. Knowledge about genetics and the risks of consanguinity was non-existent, and health difficulties were for many attributed to bad luck. However, with the increase in deformities and diseases, the family began to be seen more distant from neighboring communities. Isolation intensified, and the lack of medical and social support led to a worsening of the physical and emotional conditions of family members. The history of the Kellogg family for many years was treated as an isolated and hidden case. It was only in the early 20th century, with the advent of new genetic research, that the true extension of the consequences of consanguinity was beginning to be understood. The few surviving members of the family seeking help outside the community revealed in 1920 the continuous practice of marriages between relatives. Genetics experts, when studying family records, found that observed physical and mental problems were the direct result of the repetition of consanguineous marriages. Over time, the history of the Kellogg family was gradually being published in scientific articles and was later discussed in consanguinity and genetic studies. However, the local community and many family members who were still alive continued to live with the weight of shame, often ignoring the truth about their lineage. The Kellogg family legacy teaches us something deep about the consequences of ignorance and social isolation. The family consanguinity cycle not only resulted in physical deformities but also created a legacy of social isolation and shame that lasted for generations. The stigma associated with these practices has led many to hide their history, not out of evil but for a need to protect their identity and dignity. As we begin to understand the consequences of consanguinity, the reflection on our own social standards becomes inevitable. What stories are being hidden from us today? How many families live secret with similar stories not yet revealed to the world? What does this say about human nature and our tendency to protect what is easier to ignore? If you also feel the weight of this story, comment now. Not all families deserve to be forgotten. Don't forget to subscribe to more stories like this which need to be heard and understood. In a small town in Western Virginia where isolation and generations of consanguinity intertwine, the history of the Whitaker family emerged from the shadows, bringing out the devastating effects of lack of information on genetics. For years, the secret was maintained, with family members living on the fringes of society, carrying a stigma that should never have carried. What started with weddings between close cousins and repetition of ancestral practices would lead to extreme consequences, leaving an indelible mark in subsequent generations. The following story is not only about the Whitaker family but about how isolation and ignorance can transform lives and perpetuate suffering for several generations. The history of the Whitaker family dates back to the 1800s, when the first generations of this lineage settled in the Western Virginia, an isolated and difficult region access. Family members were predominantly farmers who lived in a small community where social relations were limited. The lack of access to formal education and the distance of urban centers made marriages between family members became the only viable option for preserving the family name and maintenance of properties. The first case of family incest occurred in the late 1800s when Edward Whitaker, a young family member, married his first cousin, Margaret Whitaker. The union was considered acceptable within the community since both were children of branches close to the same family tree and the marriage between cousins. It was not uncommon in isolated families where the population was small and the options to form new limited alliances. Although the decision to marry was voluntary, there was no deep understanding of genetic implications that this could cause. Edward and Margaret, like many others, community members were not aware of the risks that consanguinity would imply. For them, marriage was a matter of convenience and tradition, not scientific knowledge. At the time, There were no widely accessible studies on risks of incest and its consequences for the health of the descendants. The couple's first child, Ray Whittaker, was born in 1890. He had a severe microfil, a rare condition characterized by an abnormal development of brain which caused serious cognitive deficiencies. In addition, Ray faced significant motor difficulties, unable to walk without help and presenting a deep mental delay. These symptoms were not immediately attributed to consanguinity. But over time, it was clear that the repetition of marriages between cousins and close relatives had given rise to serious genetic problems. Ray was just the first of many descendants of the Whittaker family to face consequences of generations of consanguinity. Your physical and mental condition does not. It only affected its quality of life, but also stigmatized it before society, leading the family to live in even deeper isolation. The difficulties that RY faced shaped the lives of other family members who were repeating the same standards and suffering the same physical and emotional consequences. The shame and stigma associated with Ray's condition was so intense that by many years the family was avoided by other inhabitants of the region who did not understand the causes of health problems that affected the Whittaker lineage. This stigma perpetuated for generations, with the family being increasingly isolated from society, incapable to form relationships with other members of the community. It was not until 2004 that the history of the Whittaker family was brought to the great public when filmmaker Mark Leiter, known for documenting people's stories marginalized, visited the family to record its reality. Leiter filmed a documentary who exposed the living conditions of the Whittaker, revealing to the world the devastating effects of consanguinity in an isolated lineage. Leiter's documentary Soft White Underbelly not only exposed the harsh reality of family but also brought to light the genetic issues that affected the Whittaker. The movie It was a point of turning to the public understanding of the effects of consanguinity to show clearly how choices made in past generations continue to impact the physical and mental health of future generations. The repercussion of the documentary was massive, generating a wave of discussions about the genetic risks of consanguinity, especially in isolated communities. Although many assist the documentary with shock and compassion, the story also raised crucial questions about the lack of education and awareness about genetic effects in the small rural communities of the United States. The case of the Whittaker family was a milestone in the discussion about consanguinity and its consequences for health. Mark Leiter's documentary not only exposed the genetic and social problems faced by the family, but also questioned how lack of genetic information and social insulation can result in practices that without scientific knowledge are devastating to the health of future generations. The case brought to light the need for genetic education and public policies to prevent consanguinity practices in isolated communities where access to information is limited. The discussion about the social impact of consanguinity also expanded, with experts stating that it is essential to offer educational resources and awareness for these populations so that they can make informed choices about your relationships. In addition, the emotional impact of the story was deep, not just for the members of the Whittaker family, but for the entire community that watched the documentary. The shame, the isolation, and the lack of psychological support for those involved was a recurring theme in the discussions after the film's screening. One of the most amazing revelations of Leiter's documentary was the discovery that several members of the Whittaker family had tried to move away from the lineage and seek new paths, but due to isolation and lack of opportunities, they ended up returning to the cycle of consanguinity. Many of the family's latest descendants were aware of the implications of their history and sought help. But the consequences' genetics were so deep that in many cases help was not enough. The history of the Whittaker family leads us to deep reflection on how choices made by a generation can affect future ones, especially when knowledge and the resources needed to understand these choices are not accessible. The repetition of incest in the family was not an act of malice or strength, but a practice that arose need and ignorance, and its consequences were devastating. The stigma, the shame and physical and emotional consequences continue to haunt generations younger who carry the weight of a legacy they have not chosen. In the end, the history of the Whittaker family is a warning about the dangers of isolation and lack of education on genetics and public health. She teaches us that as a society, we have the responsibility to educate and inform communities to prevent practices how consanguinity result in such deep tragedies. If you also feel the weight of this story, comment now. What happens when the love between relatives becomes fatal? Don't forget to subscribe to more stories like this which need to be heard. The case of the Whittaker family is one of the most tragic examples of consanguinity and how it can profoundly affect the physical, mental, and emotional health of a lineage. The story, which was brought to light by Mark Leiter, not only revealed the consequences of consanguinity but also provoked a reflection on the impact of isolation, social and lack of education on genetics in the most remote communities. When learning with these stories, we can better understand the challenges that many communities they face and work to prevent these tragedies from repeating. The social rejection of families affected by consanguinity was not just a matter of stigma but also of institutional marginalization. For a long time, the Whittaker families were avoided by their neighbors, known and even by the members of other families. The reason was clear. Cognitive difficulties and genetic malformations were seen as a curse, something the community preferred ignore or not accept. In a testimonial of a former Avena, Martha Jennings, she reveals how the perception of community about the Whittaker family has always been negative. I remember when we were children and heard stories about the Whittaker family. Everyone talked about whispers about what was happening in that house. Nobody I wanted to approach. No one wanted to interact. People talked about how much children from there they were disfigured and they were not normal. We could not accept someone like this in our home. It was almost like a punishment to have any kind of contact with them. This type of social marginalization left a deep mark in the psyche of the members' Whittaker family, as they were rejected not only by people but also by health and education system. They lived on the sidelines with difficulties to obtain appropriate medical care, and their education was neglected as many of the family members were not considered able to attend conventional schools due to its cognitive limitations. The lack of social support made them live in progressive isolation, which only aggravated the situation of all involved. Consanguineous families such as the Whittaker have learned to survive in isolation. Without the support of the outside world and with extremely limited resources, daily life of these families was a constant battle to maintain your survival. There was no access to information on public health, education, or even psychological support, which made it even more difficult to live with quality of life. In the case of the Whittaker, in addition to the physical and psychological difficulty, there was also the challenge of maintained dignity in a society that saw them as anomalous. For many family members, their lives were spent trying to live like the others, but always with the weight of a stigma that accompanied them wherever they were. This generated a deep sense of inadequacy and lack of belonging, feelings shared by many members of the lineage. Mark Leiter's documentary provided a rare window to their lives, allowing the world knew how deep the social isolation lived by the Whittaker family was. Leiter, in an interview, commented on the experience of filming the family. The most impressive for me was the way they were in total imprisonment, but at the same time they communicated with each other in a very intimate way. There was a fortress in the way they protected themselves, but at the same time immense fragility in how they faced the world outside. It was a great privilege to document this reality, but at the same time a great responsibility. The deepest reflection generated by this case is how much ignorance and stigma they can determine the fate of a person or a family. What happened to Whittaker family raises crucial questions about how society deals with the excluded and how can we change our approach to ensure that more people do not go through this kind of suffering. In the heart of the east of Kentucky mountains, a peculiar and rare story of consanguinity and a genetic condition almost forgotten by time took shape. During generations, a family was marked by the blue color of its skin, a characteristic that would make them known as the Blue Family of Troublesome Creek. The condition, which I would intrigue scientists and doctors, was initially misunderstood and stigmatized. But how this lineage began and what impact the choices of their ancestors had in next generations. What seemed like a simple genetic phenomenon in reality revealed a complex problem of consanguinity that would generate consequences devastating. What happens when science and history intersect? Like a lineage that began with a common practice at the time, marriage between relatives resulted in such a visible and impactful condition. This is the Fugate family report. A blue blood history in which the color of his skin was not the only thing that differentiated them of the rest of society. The history of the Fugate family dates back to the 19th century, more precisely in the year 1820, when pioneers Martin Fugate and Elizabeth Smart settled in Troublesome Creek, an isolated region in the hills of Kentucky. Martin Fugate, a man of origin French, and Elizabeth of English ancestry, were destined to form a lineage marked by a rare genetic phenomenon, which seemed to be a simple union between two members of local families would soon become the beginning of a cycle of weddings between close relatives. The first marriage between Martin and Elizabeth Fugate was not uncommon for the time, especially in isolated communities where wedding options were limited. Without many other couples available, weddings between cousins and relatives next were acceptable and common in rural communities. What Martin and Elizabeth don't, they knew that their union would give rise to a recessive gene, the meta-hemoglobinemia, which would begin to be transmitted from generation to generation, changing dramatically the life of the descendants. The phenomenon that would make the Fugate family stand out and be known as the Blue family. It was a rare genetic condition called meta-hemoglobinemia which prevented the blood oxygenate properly. This resulted in a bluish skin because the blood had difficulty transporting oxygen to body cells. When the descendants of Martin and Elizabeth were born, many exhibited the visible feature of bluish skin, which for many was the first sign that something unusual was happening with this lineage. Meta-hemoglobinemia occurs due to a mutation of the gene responsible for hemoglobin, the protein that carries oxygen in the blood. In its most common form, the gene for this condition is recessive, which means that for a person to present the condition, she must inherit a copy of the gene of each parent. The rare condition did with that the skin of the fleeting family members became visibly bluish, especially when they were in natural light, a feature that soon became a marker of his family identity. With the passing of generations, the phenomenon of blue skin has become a characteristic of laundry lineage, with children being born with the condition due to the persistent practice of consanguineous marriages. Each generation continued to perpetuate this gene recessive until the condition spread through several generations, creating a lineage with visible and hereditary effects. Although the condition was a medical and biological curiosity, what perpetuated it was the marriages between relatives throughout generations, including the descendants of Martin and Elizabeth. Like many other weddings of the time, the wedding options were limited in isolated areas, and the practice of marrying close relatives was a way to maintain the properties and family ties. The first generation of meta-hemoglobinemia between the fleeting resulted in a large number of children suffered from the condition. Marriages between close relatives such as first prime continued over the years, perpetuating the meta-hemoglobinemia gene. Although consequences of consanguinity were not fully understood at the time, the marriage between Martin and Elizabeth was the first step in a long cycle that would last longer of a century. The lack of marriage alternatives outside the community and isolation geographical of families contributed to this perpetuation, with the genetic condition manifesting more and more with each generation. At first, there was no perception that the condition was directly linked to the practice of consanguinity. For the fleeting, the blue skin was simply a feature of family, and the following generations did not fully understand the consequences of genetics involved. The stigma, however, was beginning to take shape as the condition spread to more family members. As the recessive gene was transmitted from generation to generation, the condition of the skin blue manifested in various ways. Although meta-hemoglobinemia itself does not were fatal, it caused health difficulties, especially in extreme situations of lack of oxygenation and increased susceptibility to lung diseases. In addition, the physical condition generated a social stigma that the Fugate family members had to support over the years. Throughout the generations, the Fugate family began to be seen as a curiosity, but also with a look of revulsion and fear. The surrounding population, upon realizing the color peculiar of the skin of family members, it began to push them away. The stigma of being different, however, it was just one of the difficulties faced by the fleeting. Beyond physical questions, the fleet also faced emotional and psychological problems due to the social isolation and the discrimination they have suffered. The family was treated with distrust, being marginalized and stigmatized by something they could not control. It was only in the 20th century, when the fleeting family descendants began to expand to areas besides Troublesome Creek, that the true impact of meta-hemoglobinemia and its relationship with consanguinity began to be understood. At the time, doctors and geneticists began to study the case of the family and recognized that the condition was perpetuated due to the continuous practice of marriages consanguineous. The history of the Fugate family has become an important reference for studies scientific on consanguinity and the genetic effects of metahemoglobinemia. He was from the 1940s with the work of geneticists who studied the fleeting concept of recessive genetic conditions began to be more widely understood. Metahemoglobinemia was identified as a very rare condition which it results from the mutation of a specific gene and was associated with consanguinity. This case, together with other investigations into genetic diseases in communities isolated, it led to a greater debate on the effects of consanguinity on physical health. The research on the case of the fleet generated a series of questions about how practices such as consanguineous marriages can result in genetic conditions rare and how they affect human development. Studies on human genetics began to grow in importance, and the idea of avoiding such practices became a concern in society, which started as an isolated case of a bluish skin transformed into an important study on the effects of consanguinity on health human. However, the most surprising was the legacy that this study left for the scientific community only but also for society in general. Revelation public on the condition and social implications led to the formation of a new public awareness of the inherited genetic conditions, and the escape became a reference when discussing the relationship between consanguinity and genetic health. The history of the Fugate family is a clear example of how past errors, choices made by generations without understanding genetic effects, can impact the following generations in deep shapes. The case of the fleet is a warning about the need for genetic education and how isolated communities without the proper knowledge may perpetuate diseases that could be avoided. Today, the Fugate family legacy is not just an example of the consequences of consanguinity, but also an alert to the modern world about the importance of education and genetic consciousness. The study of their lives and the blue skin condition raised important questions about social isolation, stigma, and the perpetuation of genetic diseases that are still relevant.